Look, you guys all get quiet when all of a sudden the recording starts happening. Good afternoon. This is period 3, and so you should have your period 3 handout. If you don't have one, you should grab one from up on the desk up in the front of the room. We are also going to be taking a look at the writing guide for just a little bit, and so you don't need to take that out. I'm just going to highlight some things for you guys, and then we can talk about your DBQ if you'd like to as well. But I think that we'll be very easily able to get through our material by 3 o'clock and get you guys on your way. So before we get started, do you guys have any questions or problems you need to have addressed before we get rolling? Sweet. So when we think about what's going on with the review that we've done, you've already done period 1, you've already done period 2, and let me remind you of what you see going on with your concept outline. The College Board has told you, guaranteed, that none of the stuff we've done in your previous reviews will be part of short answer question number 1 or short answer question number 2. And if you don't want it to be, it won't be part of short answer question number 3. You get to choose from either periods 1 through 5 or periods 6 through 9. Each of these 2 short answer essay questions will deal with the same skill, the same theme. They'll just be from different time periods. So for your short answers, nothing from period 1 and 2 is going to affect you. Same thing with your DBQ. And when you get to your long answer essay question, if you want to do an essay question from periods 1 through 3, you can. But you'll have a choice between that or one from periods 4 through 6 or one from periods 7 through 9, all of which deal with the same themes and the same skills. So if you are thinking about what you can short when you're getting ready for the AP test, I wouldn't ignore those first 2 periods completely, but you've got laid out for you the idea that when we think about the early times, Native Americans and their complexity and diversity, the European colonization, and then especially thinking about our 13 colonies, comparing Chesapeake and New England most importantly, will be able to suffice when we think about how we get prepared. Aaron, what's up?
Yeah, so you like the questions? Maybe say take a period.
What'll happen is you're going to get on your AP test with these questions, this will be mandatory, and then they'll tell you get a choice between one of these 2. And you'll be able to see from the question type itself that it's coming from one of these 2 period sets. So it'll be pretty obvious to you you're doing it from a different time period. Any other questions before we get rolling then with your period 3 stuff? Sweet. So when we look at period 3, 1754 to 1800, this is the start of the French and Indian War, going all the way to Jefferson's election at the end of the Adams presidency. When we think about 1754, what this should be telling you is what many of you guys asked about back in the fall. So when we were in the fall, you learned about like Queen Anne's War and a bunch of other wars between England and France that drifted over to the United States. What they're essentially telling you is those earlier wars, just understand there was conflict between the British and the French, but it's not essential that you know those nitpicky wars. French and Indian War, they're setting it as a beginning point, as a turning point, to transition from one time period to another. So when you take a look at your concept outline, we want to be looking for the types of questions that you could be asked. And so a lot of the stuff that we're going to be hitting today is very much related to your DBQ that you guys are going to be doing for class on Friday. And so think about the DBQ question that you've been given. The idea from 1763 to 1783, the idea of American independence changed in some ways over time, but in some ways it stayed the same as the way that Americans felt about independence at the start of this time period during the French and Indian War. And so if you're thinking about contextualization, you could easily contextualize your DBQ with the French and Indian War or the feelings that Americans had at the time of the war. Notice what they want you to understand thematically. Can you talk about migration patterns? So they want to be able to focus on that during this time period, both migration from outside the country, but also internal migration and what that's doing. And then also, can you explain cultural interaction that's happening both here in our country and how other countries' conflicts are drifting over to the United States? So this theme that you see right here, the British are going to try to take tighter control over the North American colonies, which means they're ending what time period? Salutary neglect. There's your contextualization. So if you're thinking about your DBQ and you're trying to figure out how do I contextualize at the beginning, there's a feeling of salutary neglect that's going on during the French and Indian War that is going to color the feeling of American independence, and that's going to be a continuity throughout the whole time period. The idea that Americans want to be independent, to be away from the British, it stays the same in some ways, but in some ways it revolutionizes and changes over the time period of 1763 to 1783. So notice what you have going on here. You've got battles going on between the British and the French. And the British have these growing colonies that are expanding through the East Coast up to the Appalachian Mountains, and some people are going past the Appalachian Mountains, and they're butting up against French territory or the territory that is being inhabited by Native Americans who are friendly with the French. The term that you want to notice right here is middle ground. It was a small little part of your textbook, only about a paragraph, but it talked about how Native Americans occupied a space in that trans-Mississippi area along the Appalachian Mountains where they would play the French and the British and the Spanish against one another, and that's what they're alluding to right here. Now it mentions that the British are going to achieve a major expansion by taking out the French, but at tremendous cost, setting up the stage for imperial efforts to raise revenue. And when you see raise revenue, what is that hinting at? Taxes. And consolidate control over the colonies, which means they're going to be ending salutary neglect. And so that's what you have. Increased taxation, ending of salutary neglect. And so those are two major elements that will run their way through the DBQ. And if you watch what's happening, you can see how they're assembling the DBQ from your concept outline. It's just taking ideas from there and giving you the chance to explain them in your own words as you're writing things out. What I'd like you to do then, please, is if you could go into your Chromebook, you will be able to find that there's a document that is called Steps to the Revolution or Path to the Revolution. You created a chart in the fall that gave you all the different taxes, why the king was doing it, what his motivation was, whether or not it was successful, the impact that it had on revolutionary times. That document is going to be incredibly helpful for you when you are working your way through this concept outline. Now, this is not a paper document. This is going to be found online, and so if you want to take a second to find that, that'd be great. Road to Revolution? My fault. So one of the things we want to get into is as we start our review process, we're looking for big major terms that can be used to describe a lot of things underneath them. Like when you learn about the increase of taxation, the taking away of salutary neglect, the idea of economically having dominance over the colonies, one of the terms that you can put into the box right here is mercantilism. So the trick on your AP test is not finding decontextualization like there's a right answer. There's a bunch of them that could possibly work their way into the essay. It's your analysis that's key. So in your essay that you have, that you're working on over the next couple days, the question is, what transformed American ideas about independence? And your key is to try to find a contextualization that's the right fit to allow you to weave into a story about that. Letter C is also talking about stopping colonists from moving out west at the end of the French and Indian War. And what was that announcement called? Right? Proclamation of 1763. That's going to go right in this box over here. And remember, the king is not doing this because of an accident. He's doing it because there are legitimately Native Americans who are friendly with the French who are on the frontier. That's Pontiac's rebellion that you want to notice with the proclamation line of 1763. The king is trying to squash speculation, though. So there's land speculators in the Ohio River Valley, and especially, that's the term that you want to use right here, is many Americans would like to get to the Ohio River Valley because they could then create gigantic farm plantations, kind of like we had in the Chesapeake to start the country. So we've now seen an end of salutary neglect, a reemergence of mercantilism and dominance economically, a prohibition of land expansion, all of which could be foundational things in your DBQ about why the colonists are becoming more independent, because they're becoming more angry about specific things that the king is doing. When you look at this page, then, this is easily something you could turn into a cause and effect essay. What were the causes of American anger towards the British that led to the American Revolution? And your competition is going to end up writing down taxes. Their essay is going to be haphazard. They're going to write down taxes made the colonists mad. They hated the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Tea Act, and other acts, and that made them super mad. And kids will get then the weird notion that the Founding Fathers hated taxes When in reality, they didn't hate taxation, they hated taxation without, right? So compared to your competition, who's going to write out a 3-tax list, Sugar Act, Stamp Act, Tea Act, and they're going to argue that that's what caused the revolution, my argument is going to be that the prohibition on expansion caused by the Proclamation Line of 1763 and the new taxation that took away salutary neglect is going to lead to protests and the Enlightenment movement that is going to cause people to rethink what it means to be an American, that you are now no longer a British citizen, but you are an American colonist. If you think about those categories, they're going to create for me big body paragraphs that I then just am filling in with facts to prove that I know what I'm talking about. So it's this organization that is key when you get started. Now, what you guys are doing is not a causation question. You're doing a continuity and change over time question. But the same sort of thing is going on. Can you think about big contextualizations, big trends, that you could then turn into an argument for why either our independent streak is growing or why it's just staying the same? So if we bounce back then to your concept outline, your next segment is going to get into the idea that Americans are going to assert their ideals of self-government in the face of British efforts that are going to lead to an independence movement and a struggle for war with Britain. And what you'll see over and over again is there's a focus on our national identity, where we're going to want to know how democracy is developing in the minds of Americans. What does it mean to be an American with democracy and all the other elements that we see with independence and freedom and so on? You'll notice this theme right here is saying also, how do popular movements and reform efforts and so whatever affect American society? This same theme is the one that you're exploring with your civil rights deep dive. And so when you think about our civil rights movement, the College Board is telling you you should be linking together what the civil rights leaders are doing in the 50s and 60s with what the founding fathers are doing in the 1750s and 60s and 70s. Finally, they want to be able to talk about how America fits into the world, and so this is going to be the recurring theme throughout this entire chapter. So number one, America is going to try to resist taxation, and you see in the middle of this bunch it says the British are going to try to collect taxes without direct colonial representation or consent to British authority. This is your taxation without representation. So they're alerting you to the idea you need to be able to talk intelligently about what that looks like. For you guys then, our key is that every one of your competitors are going to be able to run through the idea that taxes made colonists mad. So you got to have at least 3 taxes in your back pocket that spread throughout the time period that are your go-to, where you're going to say that when it's time for me to prove that the colonists are being taxed without representation, this is why they're getting madder and madder until they decide to rebel. That's where your chart comes in. Now, if you can come up with 4 or 5 that are automatic for you, that's great. But with these taxes, you can't just laundry list and say, Sugar Act, tax on sugar, made colonists mad, Stamp Act, made colonists mad. Instead, specifically, you have to build a story. How is it leading to a break between the colonists and England? So take a minute with your neighbors, figure out what your list would be, and then we'll run through them to see if we can assemble a cause and effect story about how these are the causes of the American Revolution.
The key thing analytically is trying to figure out, like, would that be better used in that paragraph, or would it be better used in another paragraph? But I would be fine with that. Yeah, all the rich guys like it. Everything. All the papers. Not good enough. Let me stop you.
So if we want to play around with this chronology, we want to go from one event to another event to explain how things are taking place, because we want to do it in an organized sort of way, so we don't want to jump like all the way forward and all the way backwards and zigzag. So if you're thinking about like an early tax or an early law that is making the colonists feel like they're losing their ability to have taxation with representation, what would be a good example of that? Sugar Act, absolutely. Why would you choose that one?
I don't know how to say it.
You're right. So analytically, like, how would you use this in an essay to try to explain how the colonists feel like their independence is being undermined, and they want to start thinking about rebellion? Go ahead.
One of the first acts they did, and like after all this time is not being messed with, now they're trying to get them to make them think that they don't want to do that.
Totally.
I think they're being very
Yeah. And this tax is going to be on sweeteners, especially molasses, which is rum. Something that makes rum, which is going to help out with the slave trade. So that's going to be something that's hugely crucial for the United States. There's another tax during that time period that I refer to as being the stupidest tax ever in U.S. history, because it makes two specific groups mad: lawyers and newspapermen. Which tax is that? Stamp Act. That's going to mobilize a lot of protests around the colonies. So that's a great one to begin with. If you want to talk about the Sugar Act being the start, the Stamp Act being the one that really turned off a lot of people, what other taxes could you use? Tea Act, absolutely, in 1773. So with the Tea Act, you're going to have then the Boston Tea Party, the Intolerable Act, and that's going to lead to then the first shots of the Revolution with Lexington and Concord. You can easily fill in the middle with stuff like the Boston Massacre. You can easily talk about like the Townsend duties or whatever. We're not starting to get down to nitpicks, and one of the things we need to realize with our writing is we don't have hours and hours. We don't have 8 pages to work with. We only got a
Nancy
couple.
Burkhardt, could you please call 8800?
So for you, you got to pick and choose, but you need to pick out at least the big 3 that you can use, and it needs to be represented throughout the time period. So the mistake that a lot of people make is they'll say something like the Boston Massacre was the thing that started off the revolution, and that's 1770. So you got a 5-year gap between that and the actual shooting, which means you're wrong. And so that's where we want to be able to tie all the pieces together and make them analytically fit. Notice in the middle column that you've got letter B. It says colonial leaders based their resistance on to Britain on arguments about the rights of the British subjects. What groups of people do we want to reference when we're talking about resistance inside the colonies? Go ahead. Mayflower Compact is much earlier. Okay, so during this time period, Patriots, and what are they specifically called? Sons and Daughters of Liberty, absolutely, are the ones that you'll want to be able to mention. Also the people involved in the committee's correspondence who are sending letters back and forth throughout the colonies. They are very much being influenced to think about the idea of self-rule, especially with the ideas of the Enlightenment. And so let me remind you of John Locke, who is that guy who's talking about how you have the right to life, liberty, and property, and the government is set up to protect your rights. Be careful, though. John Locke is British. He is dead before we get even close to this time period. So if you have John Locke running around with Thomas Jefferson, whatever, you're showing that you're not really up on what you're supposed to be doing. So John Locke is an inspiration, but what he wrote previously as part of the Enlightenment, the time when they start thinking scientifically about things, that book will work its way into American hands, especially the hands of people like Ben Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, Thomas Paine, and so on. And they're going to start taking those ideas which were hypothetical, and they're going to actually start talking about incorporating them really. This will lead to political activism, where you've got boycotts, you've got attacks on tax collectors, you've got people who are writing inside the newspapers, and so they want you to be able to show how a popular movement gets started by a protest and boycotts and all sorts of demonstrations. Also mentions that in the face of economic shortages and the British occupation of some regions, men and women mobilized in large numbers to provide financial and material support to the Patriot movement. This is both before and during the war, especially during during the Intolerable Acts, but then especially during the war itself. There are people who are volunteering to help out with the war effort. If you move on to the next page. Despite considerable loyalist opposition as well as Great Britain's apparently overwhelming military and financial advantages, the Patriots' cause succeeded because of the actions of colonial militias, first of all. Secondly, the Continental Army. Thirdly, George Washington and his military leadership, where he's going to lose more battles than he wins, but he is going to force the British to chase him through the back country, and he's going to hold the army together. The colonists' ideological commitment and resilience, and assistance sent by European allies. So let's peel this apart, because there's a bunch of strategy stuff we want to know for our wars. Every single war we've studied in our class only needs to be known on these levels. Number one, what caused the war militarily? And so this is going to be Lexington and Concord will be the moment that started the war. You'll remember, though, during the first year of the war, they're still flirting with the idea of this being a conservative conflict. Let's get back to salutary neglect. They're sending the olive branch petition over to England to try to calm things down. But your battles that are important, number one, Bunker Hill, just outside of Boston, the first place where you have the American military stand up against the British military and be able to do so successfully until they run out of ammunition, giving hope to the rest of the people inside the colonies. Remember also, the British want to take over all the major cities on the eastern seaboard, and they're going to do that successfully in places like New York. But remember, most people in the country are doing what job? Farming, and so they're scattered through the back country, so they're big and they're diverse. And so remember, George Washington is famous for like the Battle of Trenton. He's able to cross the Delaware, he's able to get across, capture the Hessians during wintertime using non-conventional tactics. He's able to win a victory there. He's able to also hold his forces together at Valley Forge, where they could have disintegrated. But at the beginning of the war, the British start off in the north, capturing cities, and then midway through the war, they focus on the south, where they make the decision to announce to African Americans in the south that if they fight on the side of the British, they will be given their freedom. And southern white people then go bonkers, and they start fighting aggressively to try to hold on to their slaves. Remember your turning point of the war also, Saratoga. That's the key battle that you want to dial into that helped Ben Franklin turn the French to the side of the United States. And then finally the Battle of Yorktown, where with French assistance we're able to capture Cornwallis in 1781, and the war is done in 1783. Go ahead.
You said there are certain things that you know about wars in general throughout the course. What else besides what
Causes, turning points, end results, and then what's happening on the home front to support the war effort. So we're now done with the American Revolution, and one of the things you should be thinking about is we're now covered with some of the stuff that you guys are going to be thinking about with your DBQ. So when we think about your DBQ itself, remember how I told you with the Revolution, there is a turning point in the Revolutionary War itself, and that's the Declaration of Independence. When Jefferson writes the Declaration of Independence, he incorporates John Locke's ideas that's saying things like all men are granted the right to life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. These rights are inalienable. The government's job is to protect those rights, and so he's taking John Locke's philosophy and making it into a real government. It then changes the idea. We're not going back to salutary neglect. Midway through the Revolution, we're trying for something new. And so it's that transition that your DBQ is trying to get to the heart of. Can you actually explain that using specific facts and specific events to try to draw out that argument inside your writing? Now, when we move to your next section, this is where they're pulling that out. The ideas that inspired the revolutionary cause reflected new beliefs about politics, religion, and society that had been developing over the course of the 1700s. So first of all, notice the idea that the Enlightenment is taking off inside the United States. This is going to be pushed forward by Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, which you can see down here, Thomas Paine's Common Sense. It's leading people to reconsider religion. There's a flourishing of people who are challenging traditional fundamentalist religion with ideas like deism and other sorts of movements that are trending towards in the direction of science. But it's this sort of trend that you see going on that is then going to influence our shift to a new type of independence that's going to be happening as a result of the revolution when we totally break away from the British. Down here at the bottom of the page, during and after the revolution, an increased awareness of inequalities in society motivated some individuals to push for abolition and greater political democracy inside the government itself. So some people are going to practice manumission. This is where you set your slaves free so that they can then have the opportunity to have their own lives, with the feeling that with the Declaration of Independence, slavery was incompatible. And you have that weird dynamic that Jefferson, who owns slaves, is somebody who also is trying to write in the Declaration that slavery is evil and it should be abolished. And the only thing that keeps it out of the Declaration is the fact that there are Southerners who argue during the Revolution that they're willing to split and fracture into a civil war if we start talking about abolishing slavery. And so Jefferson tried to introduce it, and then it's dumped out. As you move forward also, notice the role of women during the war, and one of the famous sayings that you'll want to be able to notice is Abigail Adams. Her comment to John Adams during the Constitution of "Remember the Ladies," where she says, if you're going to be radical, include the women in this process, and he doesn't, is an element that you can weave through this time period. Women and men are largely working on farms together during this time period, so they very much are not working in separate spheres. So you should notice this is the era of Republican motherhood, the idea that the ideal mother is somebody who's home with the kids, she's educated so she can raise good, small r Republican babies who can grow up to be good American patriots who will constantly resist the evils of tyranny and dictatorship and abuses and so on. In the 1800s, that's going to shift from Republican motherhood to the cult of domesticity, with the idea that there are different spheres for men and women. Men go to the office, women stay at home, and that's their domestic sphere or the home sphere, where they're there to raise children, similar to Republican motherhood, but less focused on the idea of patriotism and building up those people for that purpose. Finally, notice the bottom of the page. They definitely want you to understand that the Declaration of Independence has been revolutionary through all of U.S. history, so it's going to be very much something that reverberates in the French Revolution. Remember the Haiti Revolution with Toussaint Louverture in the early 1800s, where the country of Haiti is overthrown from French rule by the African slaves who are in that area, and that's going to freak out Southerners in the early 1800s that could happen here. So it's going to reinforce our black codes. It's going to happen in Latin America. Eventually, Vietnam is going to use our declaration to try to get us joined with Ho Chi Minh during the Vietnam conflict. So over and over again, the declaration will reverberate there. But then also remind me again, what times have you heard the Declaration being used inside the United States for people's rights? Seneca Falls and Lincoln during the Gettysburg Address, 7 years ago, our founding fathers brought forth blah, blah, blah. That's this. And so the Declaration is something that constantly starts weaving through a lot of threads that we have inside of our course. Next, they want you to think about the governments that we created after the Revolutionary War was done. And with this, you'll notice that there's a theme that runs throughout the course where they want you to understand that we have interpreted the Constitution differently over time. So they want you to be able to think about the parts of the Constitution they want you to understand: legislative, judicial, executive, checks and balances, separation of powers. All those ideas are things that you should understand. But this is also where you get into the debate of like strict versus loose constructionism. So they want you to remember that debate between Hamilton and Jefferson is still around nowadays. They want you to understand how our political ideas develop. They want you to understand how our federal government develops. And they also want you to understand how capitalism is going to be developing during this time period. So first of all, they want you to understand that after the declaring independence, we had political leaders creating new constitutions defining the role of government. And first of all, they want you to be able to explain that this starts at the state level. So at the state level, many states build brand new constitutions that become the laboratories for democracy that teach us what our main government should look like. Notice the possibility of a compare-contrast question in period 3, where they're telling you you need to know about the Articles of Confederation and you need to be able to compare it to the Constitution. So your articles are really simple. It's a wartime government. It's only got one branch, a legislative branch. You can send as many people to the Congress as you want to, but each state only gets one vote. So if you divide your vote, then you don't get to vote as a state. Many decisions require a supermajority. So not just half, but a supermajority instead. And some major changes like taxation require unanimous approval. And the state that loves voting no is Rhode Island, because they love being difficult. So you're going to have the feeling of states' rights, confederacy. And remember, the idea of confederacy is going to be picked up again by the people during the Civil War, because they love the idea of states' rights with the issue of slavery. If you also notice with the documentary I've been showing you about the civil rights movement, you went from not seeing the Confederate flag to all of a sudden you get to Little Rock and you're really seeing the Confederate flag. And so in the 50s, that's when we see a lot of Confederate monuments being built and Civil War flags coming out, because they're back to the idea of states' rights on the issue of segregation. So this is a recurring idea that keeps floating through our society. When delegates got together, they're going to participate in a constitutional convention to redo our government because the articles are doing so bad. So your turning point is Shays' Rebellion. Remember, this is a group of Massachusetts farmers who are really mad about what's going on with the foreclosure of their farms, and so they are trying to take back the ownership of their farms, and this is causing battles to break out, and the politicians realize there are Daniel Shayses all over the United States. So the people who want to redo the Constitution are James Madison, father of the Constitution, Alexander Hamilton, who becomes very much a deep thinker on the Federalist Papers, and then finally John Jay, our first Supreme Court Chief Justice. As we look at the Constitution, this is right here asking you to understand the basics of the Constitution. So we got three branches: executive, which is enforcing the laws; legislative, making laws; judicial, which is going to get into the creation of our laws. We have separation of powers, where each branch has their own roles, and we have checks and balances where they check up on each other. We're going to find that our Constitution is built by a bunch of compromises. So the compromise that you see happening right here is we're going to have a compromise between big states and small states that's known as the Great Compromise, and it creates a bicameral legislature. This bicameral legislature is going to give way more power to southern farming states because of the fact that each state gets 2 senators, no matter how big or how small. They also get 1 representative, no matter how small, with population, and so you're going to find a lot of farm states really overrepresented, which gives more power, but they're not going to be satisfied with that. So remember, the next compromise is your 3/5 compromise. Southern states want more representation in the House of Representatives because they want to count African American slaves as being people who are also counted for the census. Also remember, until 1808, the slave trade is going to be permitted, bringing slaves in from outside the country. And also, they're going to prohibit the discussion of slavery inside Congress until 1808 because they think that slavery is dying out, which is true until the 1790s with what invention? You're awesome. Moving on to the next spot right here, they then wanted to be able to explain how did the Anti-Federalists debate with the Federalists. And remember, the Anti-Federalists desperately want to add a Bill of Rights that lay out specifically what rights are protected for Americans from the power of the government. Hamilton claimed that this wasn't necessary, but here's some things that you can add into the box over here, which are incidents to prove the Anti-Federalists were on the right track. Remember, shortly after this moment, we're going to have the Alien and Sedition Acts during Adams's presidency, where people are essentially going to have, the government's going to have the power to round up people who are seen as dangerous immigrants and kick them out of the country. You also see this with the Espionage and Sedition Act during the Wilson presidency, doing precisely the same thing. You have also seen during the HUAC and McCarthyism, people losing their rights of protection during trials because the government is going to run over those rights in fear of communism. You've also seen like the internment camps during World War II with the Japanese citizens who are losing their right to freedom because they are suspected. So you have a number of instances that prove the Anti-Federalists were on the right track, where they realize our government might get abusive if they had the power to do so. It's at this point, though, that the Constitution is done, and as a result of the American Revolution, we're going to come up with different forms of government and different interpretations of that government. So let's start, first of all, with Washington and Adams inside this box. They are both leaning in the Federalist direction. Even though Washington claims he has no party, he is leaning Federalist. The precedents that George Washington sets down are a bunch. And so if you want to get ready to write stuff into the box or check to see if you've got these things, number one, remember, he sets down the precedent of only 2 terms in office that is going to last until who breaks that? FDR, fantastic. He sets down the precedent that he should be known as Mr. President, not like our esteemed leader, our supreme higher. I mean, it's just Mr. President is the name that he wants to go by. He is going to work with Congress, but he's not going to be controlled by Congress. And so he is somebody who's going to believe that he has the authority to make decisions on his own without congressional approval. He is also somebody who realizes financially we need help, and so he is a loose constructionist. He sets the example that you can use the elastic clause to stretch the Constitution in ways that wasn't initially written in the Constitution. And you see that with Alexander Hamilton and his plans for dealing with our debt. And so he has 4 plans for dealing with the debt. 3 of them go into effect. The first thing that he says is that we should have funding at par, which means if America owes anybody debts, we should repay them at face value. Secondly, he believes in assumption, where he wants to gather up all the states' debts together and have the federal government pay them back, because then the federal government will get the credit for paying people back. Plus also, if the federal government has a gigantic debt, what can they start charging? Taxes. And so we're going to create excise taxes and tariffs and whatever to pay for the debts that we've racked up. Thirdly, we need to create an institution to pay back our debts. What's that institution called? The controversial bus that's going to come into existence during that time period. His fourth idea is he wanted to create subsidies, where he wanted to take government money and give it to businesses that he wanted to help grow so that we would then be able to industrialize quickly. That eventually happened in the late 1800s, early 1900s, but at this time it's seen as the wrong thing to do. Be careful, though, it's not communism, because communism isn't even a thing until the mid-1800s. So it may feel communistic or it may feel socialistic. Those ideas aren't even floating out there yet. With George Washington, also remember a couple other things that he's into. Number one, we have already seen during the time period of the Articles of Confederation, the Spanish have now closed down New Orleans, and we can't use the Mississippi River because our military is too weak. So let me remind you of the 2 treaties that Washington's into. He's going to pass Jay's Treaty, which is a deal that gives England pretty much everything they ever wanted. But as a result, the Spanish are going to get confused, and they're going to pass what's called Pinckney's Treaty, or the Treaty of San Lorenzo, where they think America and England are on the same team. And so they're going to work out a deal, and they're going to say, we're going to reopen the Mississippi River. You can even have a chunk of Florida, because they're afraid of us possibly being on their wrong side. During Washington's time, you also have the Battle of Fallen Timbers, led by Mad Anthony Wayne, which is another example of Native Americans not being able to peacefully coexist with Americans. They're being shoved out of the Ohio River Valley. Then finally, remember Washington's farewell address, where he says, stay out of European conflicts on the landmass over there, stay out of entangling alliances, which we will do until what war? World War I, fantastic. And then he says also, avoid political parties. And you can see that that worked out badly, because in the next section, they want you to discuss political parties, Federalists, Democratic, Republicans. So let's do a really quick breakdown of those 2 parties. Federalists are the party of Hamilton, Washington, and Adams. They believe in loose constructionism. They love factories and cities. They love the British. They love bankers. Jefferson is part of the Democratic Republicans, who is also with James Madison. They love farmers. They love strict constructionism until they get power, and then Louisiana Purchase shows they too can be loose constructionists. They love the French for their French Revolution. And this is going to lead to problems then during the Adams presidency, because during the Adams presidency, the major issue during Adams's time is a war called the Quasi-War with the French. We get insulted because the XYZ affair, where we go over and ask to negotiate, and they say no, and they demand a bribe, and when we say no, we then start mobilizing for war, and we create the Alien and Sedition Acts, which are meant to punish the Democratic Republican Party. It's going to make it hard for immigrants to vote. It's going to create laws that allow us to kick out immigrants. When we talk about anti-immigrant laws, what are those things called? What's that movement called where we hate immigrants? Nativism. Fortunately, though, Adams is going to send ambassadors over to France. They're going to work out a deal. They're going to not go to war, and eventually Jefferson's going to get elected in the peaceful revolution of 1800. Let's take a look at the last things that we have here then. We're going to have the expansion of slavery because of the creation of the cotton gin in the 1790s. This is going to lead to the rising abolitionist movement with manumission as a key centerpiece. And shortly afterwards, they're going to start creating the American Colonization Society with the idea they're going to send Africans to Africa to get them out of the United States. We also have ideas about national identity working its way into our art, literature, and architecture. This is just kind of an aside where a lot of our artwork is being inspired by European trends, but we still have feelings of nationalism that's working its way through our artwork. So we love like portraiture of the presidents and paintings of great heroic events and so on. Your final section that you have down here, they want you to understand that interactions with different groups is going to cause issues moving in the future. So various American Indian tribes are going to constantly try to figure out alliances with the Europeans. This is again known as your middle ground. But notice with the middle ground, like the Battle of Fallen Timbers, just because they're working the middle ground, eventually the Native Americans are going to lose that ability to play one group off the other one, especially after the War of 1812. When the British go away, and it's just the Americans inside the United States, the Native Americans are going to lose that ability. We're going to find that waves of immigrants come into the country. They start pushing into the backcountry across the Appalachian Mountains. And that's going to eventually bring us tension with the War of 1812 because the British still retain Canada and the Mississippi River after this time. During the Articles of Confederation, remember the one major accomplishment the Articles had, the creation of the Northwest Ordinance and the Land Ordinance, where they divided up their land into a grid pattern, setting aside public school space out west. But the big thing you want to notice is in this government that is super weak, that can get hardly anything done, they come out with a statement that slavery can't work in this area. When we get to the Compromise of 1850, William Seward is going to point that out in his debate about California, where he's going to say, of course the federal government can jump into the issue of slavery. Washington and Jefferson and all these guys did it way back when, and it was legit then. It's still legit now. We're also going to find that this ambiguous relationship with the colonists is going to cause tensions. So the Battle of Fallen Timbers definitely fits here. And also the idea that the Americans are trying to sign treaties with whoever they can to take land away, whether or not that person is actually authorized to sell Native American land. Finally, notice the Spanish, they are still here in the United States. They are moving into California, although I do not believe that this is going to be a major portion of your test. They still retain portions of the southern part of the United States, like New Orleans, until they give it to the French, which then will sell that to the United States and Louisiana Purchase. And they still have Spanish Florida at that time. Finally, we're going to forge relationships with the British and with the Spanish who are here inside the United States. That is Jay's Treaty, Pinckney's Treaty. War between France and Britain, that is your XYZ affair and the quasi-war. And then finally, Washington's farewell address is the one that tells us avoid political parties because they will divide rather than unite. And then also be careful of getting involved in European alliances and European land wars, which we obey up until World War I. After World War I, when we return to normalcy, we go back to that with isolationism. But post-World War II, with the UN and NATO, we feel like that advice is outdated. That is period 3. Period 4 then is Jefferson, going all the way up through the Polk presidency, which is moving from Jeffersonian democracy to Jacksonian democracy, and getting us close to that point of expansion right at the point of the Mexican-American War. So that's the first thing we'll do when we come back for our reviews after break. I got to tell you, though, the content that you've covered is the trickiest for kids to wrap their heads around, because once we get to the point where we're working towards the Civil War, most kids find that to be easier, and you've got it done before you go to spring break. And so for you guys, you got 2 months, time off. You should enjoy your break. And let me know if there's anything that needs to be retaught or more understood, because if at this point you're feeling sketchy, you again are ahead of your competition, because most people aren't working as hard as you are right now to get this stuff locked in. Any questions? Sweet. Enjoy your afternoon. Let me know if I can help.